The sound of boots dragging through dirt was the first sign that her solitary world was about to shatter. Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the cracked window of her cabin, watching a figure stumble across the barren field that separated her home from the rest of creation. The man moved like death itself was pulling him forward by invisible strings, each step a battle against gravity and time. Blood trailed behind him in the dust, dark drops that caught the fading light of dusk like fallen stars. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She should have barred the door. Should have blown out the candle and pretended she wasn't home. Should have done what any sensible woman living alone in the Colorado Territory would do when a stranger approached with violence written in his wake. But Margaret Whitmore had stopped making sensible choices the day she decided to stay in this godforsaken place where even the wind seemed to whisper warnings. The man collapsed 3 feet from her porch steps, his body hitting the earth with the finality of a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Margaret stood frozen behind her window, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow, desperate rhythms. In his coat pocket, she could see the outline of a gun. On his belt, a knife with a handle worn smooth by hands that had known violence. But it was his face that made her decision for her young, maybe 25, with features that spoke of someone's son, someone's brother, someone who had once been loved before the world had carved him into something dangerous. Margaret opened her door and stepped into the gathering darkness, carrying with her the last loaf of bread she had baked that morning. Never knowing it would become the most important meal she would ever serve, Margaret Whitmore had been alone for 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that she was counting, but when silence becomes your only companion, you tend to mark time differently. The cabin sat on 40 acres of stubborn Colorado earth, too far from Denver to hear the church bells, too close to the mountains to ignore the wolves that sang their hunger to the moon each night. She had built this isolation deliberately, stone by stone, choice by choice. After Thomas died, not her husband, never her husband. Though the town of Cedar Falls had whispered otherwise, she had packed her few belongings, sold her father's farm, and bought this land from a desperate prospector who swore it held silver. It held nothing but rocks and disappointment, which suited Margaret perfectly. Disappointment she understood. Silver was for people who still believed in luck. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles east, a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who had once ridden over to introduce herself and never returned. Margaret had been polite but cold, offering neither coffee nor conversation. She had learned that kindness was often mistaken for invitation, and she had no room in her life for complications. Mrs. Patterson had left with pursed lips and knowing eyes, the kind that said she understood exactly what type of woman chose to live alone in the wilderness. Margaret's days followed a rhythm as predictable as the sunrise. She woke before dawn, fed her 3 chickens and 1 stubborn goat, checked the small garden that somehow managed to grow despite the reluctant soil. She baked bread twice a week, canned vegetables when they were plentiful, and spent the long afternoons reading the same 5 books she had carried from her old life. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the mountains paint themselves purple against the sky, listening to the conversations between coyotes and considering whether loneliness was really such a terrible thing after all. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by hands that understood the difference between shelter and home. Thomas had helped her choose the location during one of his visits to Cedar Falls, back when she still believed their story might have a different ending. He had pointed to this spot on the surveyor's map and said, "Here, Maggie. Build it here, where you can see trouble coming from any direction." She had laughed then, thinking he was being dramatic. Now she understood that Thomas Brennan had never said anything without purpose. Thomas had been a doctor, one of the good ones who believed healing was a calling rather than a business. He had come to Cedar Falls to treat an outbreak of scarlet fever that had claimed 12 children in 2 weeks, staying long enough to see every patient through their crisis, and long enough to fall in love with the woman who had volunteered to nurse the sick when everyone else was too afraid. Margaret had been 26 then, old enough to know better but young enough to believe that love could conquer the practical problems of their impossible situation. He was married. Of course, they always were, the good ones. His wife lived in Boston with their 2 children, a life of society dinners and piano lessons that might as well have existed on another planet. Thomas never spoke of leaving her, and Margaret never asked him to. Instead, they had carved out a secret world in the spaces between his visits. 3 days here, a week there, always careful, always discreet, always doomed. The town had known anyway. Towns always know. Cedar Falls was small enough that a stranger couldn't sneeze without someone offering both a handkerchief and an opinion about his character. When Dr. Thomas Brennan began making regular visits that had nothing to do with medical emergencies, the whispers started. When those visits continued for 2 years, the whispers became accusations. Margaret learned to shop early in the morning, when the streets were empty, learned to sit in the back pew at church where the righteous glances couldn't find her as easily, learned to carry her shame like a stone in her chest that grew heavier with each passing day. Thomas had wanted to take her away from all of it. "Come to Denver," he had said during their last conversation, his hands gentle on her face as they stood in the garden behind her father's house. "I'll set up a practice there. We can start over where nobody knows us." But Margaret had seen the way his eyes couldn't quite meet hers when he made that promise, had heard the hesitation in his voice that spoke of a man trying to convince himself as much as her. "And your family?" she had asked quietly. "Ill. I'll find a way to explain." But they both knew there was no explanation that would satisfy a wife and children, no story that would make abandonment sound noble. Thomas was a good man caught in an impossible situation, and good men don't destroy innocent lives to save their own happiness. Margaret had kissed him goodbye that night, knowing she would never see him again. And she had been right. The letter had come 3 months later, delivered by a postal clerk who couldn't quite hide his curiosity about who might be writing to the spinster Margaret Whitmore. Thomas's handwriting was careful and formal, the words of a man trying to maintain dignity while delivering devastating news. He had been killed in a carriage accident in Denver, thrown from his seat when the horses spooked at thunder. The funeral had been attended by hundreds, the letter said, written by his medical partner who thought she should know. Dr. Brennan had spoken of her often, had called her his greatest regret and his deepest joy in the same breath. Margaret had burned the letter after reading it 17 times, but she couldn't burn the words. They lived in her chest now, alongside the stone of shame and the smaller, sharper weight of a love that had been real but impossible. She had sold her father's farm within the month and used the money to buy this land, this cabin, this chance to disappear from a world that had never quite known what to do with her. The isolation had been healing at first, like salve on a wound that needed air and time to close properly. She learned to bake bread without measuring, to coax vegetables from stubborn ground, to sleep through the night without reaching for someone who would never be there again. She discovered that solitude was different from loneliness, that silence could be a comfort rather than a punishment. The mountains kept their own counsel, asking nothing from her but presence. The seasons changed without requiring her participation. The sun rose and set regardless of her pain. But 2 years was a long time to live with only chickens and a goat for company. Margaret found herself talking to them sometimes, long conversations about the weather or the state of the garden that they received with the polite attention of creatures who understood that humans needed to hear their own voices occasionally. She named them carefully. The chickens were Faith, Hope, and Charity, a trinity of brown feathers and indignant clucks. The goat was Patience, though she possessed none of the virtue herself, being prone to eating Margaret's laundry and staring at her with judgmental yellow eyes. Some nights, especially during the long winter months, when the snow buried the world in silence, so complete it felt like being entombed. Margaret wondered if she had made a mistake, if perhaps there was such a thing as too much solitude, too much silence, too much time alone with thoughts that circled like vultures. She would sit by the fire with her needlework and listen to the wind rattling the shutters, feeling like the only person left alive in a world that had forgotten how to hold human voices. But then spring would come, tentative and hopeful, and she would remember why she had chosen this life. The mountains would shed their snow like old grief, revealing green slopes and wildflowers that bloomed without permission or planning. The air would warm and fill with the songs of birds that had survived another winter. The world would offer itself again, patient and beautiful and uncomplicated, asking nothing more from her than witness. Margaret had been standing in her garden, pulling weeds that grew faster than her vegetables when she first heard the sound. A low rumble like distant thunder, but the sky was clear and cloudless. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and listened more carefully. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast across hard ground. Still far away but coming closer. She had never had visitors on horseback. Mrs. Patterson arrived in a wagon. When she came calling, and the postal clerk rode a gentle mare that barely managed a trot. These horses were running, and running horses usually meant trouble. Margaret gathered her tools quickly and made her way back to the cabin, not quite running but moving with the purposeful haste of someone who had learned to trust her instincts. About danger dot from her kitchen window. She could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, maybe 2 miles away, and moving in her direction. 5 or 6 riders, judging by the size of the cloud, riding hard like they were being chased or doing the chasing. Either way, she wanted no part of it. Margaret checked that her rifle was loaded and within easy reach, then settled down to wait and see if they would pass by her land without stopping. They didn't pass by. The riders crested the small hill that marked the eastern boundary of her property and paused there, silhouettes against the afternoon sky. Even at this distance, Margaret could see they were studying her cabin, making decisions. She held her breath and tried to make herself invisible behind the faded curtains Thomas had once said reminded him of summer clouds. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the riders moved on, heading south toward the main road that led to Colorado Springs. Margaret watched until they disappeared behind another rise, then continued watching for another hour to make sure they weren't coming back. Only when the dust had settled completely and the mountains had returned to their usual peaceful silence did she allow herself to breathe normally again. But the encounter had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. In 2 years of living alone, no one had ever come close enough to pose a threat. She had chosen this land specifically for its isolation, its distance from the main roads and settlements where trouble usually bred. The fact that a group of armed men had found their way here, even if they hadn't stopped, reminded her that no place was truly safe from the violence that seemed to follow human beings wherever they gathered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, Margaret double-checked all her locks and kept the rifle beside her bed. She slept poorly, starting awake at every sound, the settling of wood in the cooling air, the scratch of branches against the roof, the distant call of an owl. Each noise seemed louder than usual, more ominous, as if the very darkness had taken on a malevolent weight. She woke before dawn feeling unrested and anxious, a combination that followed her through her morning chores and into the day. The chicken seemed to sense her mood, clucking nervously and refusing to venture far from the coop. Even Patience the goat appeared subdued, watching Margaret with those unsettling yellow eyes as if she knew something was coming that no one was prepared for. Margaret tried to shake off the feeling by throwing herself into work. She spent the morning tending her garden with unusual intensity, pulling every weed, watering every plant, organizing her tools with the kind of desperate Precision that comes from trying to control something, anything, when the world feels unpredictable. She baked bread in the afternoon, kneading the dough longer than necessary, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her hands working the grain into something nourishing and good. It was while the bread was cooling on the kitchen table, filling the cabin with the warm, yeasty smell of home, that Margaret heard the second sound. Not hoofbeats this time, but something worse, the irregular stumble of footsteps, heavy and uneven, accompanied by labored breathing that spoke of pain and desperation. She moved to the window carefully, keeping herself hidden behind the curtain, and saw him. A man, tall and lean, wearing a dark coat that was torn and stained with what looked like blood. He moved like someone who was fighting to stay upright, each step a victory over whatever force was trying to drag him down. His hat was gone, revealing dark hair matted with sweat and dust. In the fading light of evening, she could see that his face was young but haggard, marked by pain and something that might have been fear. Margaret's first instinct was the sensible. Bar the door, blow out the lights, wait for him to move on or collapse somewhere that wasn't her problem. She had built this life specifically to avoid complications, and a wounded stranger was the definition of complication. But as she watched him struggle across her field, stumbling over rocks and fighting to stay conscious, something in her chest began to ache in a way that had nothing to do with self-preservation. He looked so young. Too young to be carrying whatever burden had brought him to her door bleeding and desperate. Margaret found herself thinking of Thomas, who had once told her that healing wasn't about deserving, it was about need. You don't ask a drowning man if he's a good swimmer before you throw him a rope, he had said while treating a drifter who had been beaten by vigilantes for the crime of looking foreign. You save him first, ask questions later. The stranger made it almost to her porch before his strength finally gave out. Margaret watched from behind her curtain as he fell to toe. His knees, then forward onto his hands, his whole body shaking with the effort of staying conscious. He looked up once toward her window, and even through the glass and gathering darkness, she could see his eyes dark, desperate, and startlingly young. Margaret made her decision without thinking about it too hard, because thinking would have led to caution, and caution would have led to watching a boy die in her yard while she did nothing. She grabbed the loaf of bread from her kitchen table still warm, the crust golden brown and perfect, and opened her door. The evening air was cool against her face as she stepped onto the porch, and she could smell rain approaching from the west, carried on a wind that spoke of change coming whether she was ready for it or not. The young man had collapsed completely now, his face pressed against the dirt of her yard, his breathing shallow and irregular. "Hey," she called softly, not wanting to startle him but needing to know if he was still conscious. "Can you hear me?" He turned his head slightly, enough to look at her with eyes that held more pain than someone his age should have been able to carry. When he tried to speak, only a harsh whisper emerged, but Margaret could make out the words, "Please help. Margaret Whitmore, who had spent 2 years avoiding complications, who had built her life around the principle of careful solitude, stepped off her porch and into whatever trouble this young stranger had brought to her door. She knelt beside him in the dust, still holding her fresh bread, and made the second decision that would change everything. "I'm going to help you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to bloom in her chest. "But first, I need you to tell me, are you alone?" The young man's eyes flickered with something that might have been relief or might have been calculation. His lips moved again, forming words she had to lean close to hear. Not alone, never. Alone. And Margaret Whitmore, who had chosen isolation as protection, who had wrapped herself in solitude like armor, realized that she was about to discover just how fragile that protection really was. The young man's weight was surprising as Margaret helped him to his feet. For someone who looked half dead, he was solid muscle and bone, the kind of lean strength that came from a life lived hard and fast. His arm draped across her shoulders felt like iron wrapped in flesh, and she could feel the heat of fever radiating through his torn coat. Each step toward her cabin door was a negotiation between his failing strength and her determination not to let him fall again. "What's your name?" she asked as they struggled up the 3 wooden steps to her porch. The question was practical. If he died in her cabin, she would need something to tell the authorities beyond young man with dark hair. "Jesse," he whispered, the word barely audible above the sound of their labored breathing. "Jesse Caldwell." Margaret filed the name away as she maneuvered him through her doorway, noting how his eyes swept the interior of her cabin with the quick, assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and escape routes. Even dying, apparently, outlaws maintained their survival instincts. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Her cabin's main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once, furnished with pieces she had built herself from lumber purchased in Colorado Springs. The furniture was functional rather than beautiful, a table scarred from years of meal preparation, 2 chairs that didn't quite match, a bookshelf holding her precious collection of novels and medical texts that had belonged to her father. Everything was clean and orderly, the home of someone who found comfort in controlling what little she could control. Jesse Caldwell collapsed into one of her chairs with a sound that was part relief, part pain. Up close, in the warm light of her oil lamp, Margaret could see the full extent of his condition. The dark stains on his coat were definitely blood, both fresh and dried, and the way he held his left side suggested broken ribs or worse. His face was pale beneath several days' worth of stubble, and his lips had taken on the bluish tinge that spoke of shock and blood loss, but it was his youth that struck her most forcefully. Without the dust and shadows of the evening light, she could see that Jesse Caldwell was barely more than a boy, 22 or 23 at most, with the kind of fine-boned features that suggested he had come from gentler circumstances before life had carved him into whatever he was now. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were long-fingered and elegant. The hands of someone who might have been a pianist or a clerk or a dozen other respectable things in a different world. "Let me see your injuries," Margaret said, moving toward the kitchen area where she kept her medical supplies. Her father had been a frontier doctor before settling in Cedar Falls, and she had inherited both his instruments and his practical knowledge of treating wounds. Thomas had added to her education during their time together, teaching her techniques he had learned in Boston hospitals. She might not have a medical degree, but she had sewn up more cuts and set more bones than most people would in a lifetime. Jesse shook his head weakly. "No time," he managed. "They single quotes read ... coming, my brothers. They think," he struggled to form the words, each syllable an effort, "think you might hurt me." The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Brothers, plural. Armed men who were tracking Jesse Caldwell to her cabin, operating under the assumption that she might pose a threat to their injured family member. She thought of the riders she had seen earlier, the way they had paused on the hill to study her property, and realized with growing dread that they hadn't been passing through at all. They had been scouting. "How many brothers?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she gathered bandages and antiseptic from her medical kit. "4, Jesse whispered. Maybe ... maybe 5. Lost count when ... when the shooting started." Margaret's hands stilled on the medical supplies. 5 armed men, possibly more, riding toward her isolated cabin under the mistaken belief that she had harmed their brother. Men who lived outside the law, who solved problems with violence rather than conversation. She had helped wounded people before, but never under circumstances that might result in her own death. The rational thing to do would be to put Jesse back outside, let his brothers find him on her porch, and take him away to die somewhere that wasn't her responsibility. She could claim she had never seen him, that he had collapsed there on his own. it would be believable. Wounded men often sought out the first shelter they could find. She would be safe, and whatever happened to Jessie Caldwell would happen without her involvement. But Margaret found herself looking at the bread she still held in her hands, the loaf she had pulled from the oven less than an hour ago. The crust was golden brown and perfect, the interior soft and white, made from flour she had purchased with money earned from selling eggs to Mrs. Patterson. It was simple food, the kind that sustained life without fanfare or decoration, the kind that spoke of home and safety and the basic human kindness that said, "You are hungry, so I will feed you." "When did you last eat?" she asked Jessie, setting the medical supplies aside for the moment. He looked at her with confusion, as if the question didn't make sense in the context of his current crisis. 2.3 days, maybe longer. Margaret began slicing the bread with steady strokes of her kitchen knife, each piece thick and substantial. She had learned to bake from her mother, who had learned from her mother, in a chain of women who understood that feeding people was one of the most fundamental acts of humanity. You fed the hungry not because they deserved it, but because hunger was a kind of suffering that could be relieved with something as simple as bread and kindness. "Eat," she said, placing a slice in Jessie's trembling hands. "Whatever else happens, you're going to eat." Jessie stared at the bread as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he was seeing. His fingers shook as he brought it to his mouth, and Margaret watched him take the first bite with the desperate hunger of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be nourished. He ate slowly at first, then faster, as if afraid the bread might disappear if he didn't consume it quickly enough. Margaret cut more slices, spreading them with butter from her small store and honey from the wild bees that nest on the rocks behind her cabin. She watched Jessie eat with the focused intensity of a man trying to rebuild his strength, one bite at a time, and she found herself remembering Thomas's words about healing. Sometimes the body needed medicine, but sometimes it needed something. Simpler food, rest, the knowledge that someone cared enough to offer comfort without conditions. "Why are you doing this?" Jessie asked when he had finished the third slice. His voice was stronger now, though still rough with exhaustion. "You don't know me, don't know what I've done." Margaret considered the question as she filled a cup with water from her pitcher. It was a fair point. She knew nothing about Jessie Caldwell except that he was young, wounded, and apparently part of a family that solved problems with guns. For all she knew, he was a murderer, a thief, or worse. Common sense dictated that she should be afraid of him, cautious at the very least. But as she looked at his face, still pale, still marked by pain, but no longer quite so desperate, she found that fear wasn't what she felt. Instead, she felt something that had been dormant in her chest for 2 years, something that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with the simple recognition of one human being seeing another in need. "Because you're hungry," she said finally, offering him the cup of water. "Because you're hurt. Because I have bread and you don't." Jessie drank the water slowly, watching her over the rim of the cup with eyes that seemed older than his years. "That's it? That's reason enough?" "It's reason enough for tonight." The sound of thunder rolled across the mountains, closer now than before. Margaret could smell the approaching rain on the wind that rattled her shutters, and she knew that within an hour, the storm would hit with the full force of a Colorado downpour. Any riders caught in the open would be forced to seek shelter, which meant Jessie's brothers might not arrive until morning. The delay would give her time to tend his wounds properly, to make sure he was strong enough to travel when they came for him. "Tell me about your injuries," she said, returning to her medical supplies. "Where are you hurt?" Jessie's hand moved instinctively to his left side, where Margaret could see fresh blood staining his shirt beneath the torn coat. "Bullet," he said simply. "Went through, but something's wrong inside. Hurts to breathe." Margaret nodded, recognizing the symptoms of internal bleeding or damaged organs. It was the kind of injury that could kill a man slowly, over hours or days, as his body gradually shut down from trauma. Without proper medical attention, Jesse Caldwell would likely die before his brothers ever found him. "I need to examine the wound," she said. "Can you remove your coat and shirt?" Jesse hesitated, and Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of trust against vulnerability that came from a life where showing weakness could be fatal. But whatever he saw in her face must have convinced him, because he began the slow, painful process of removing his outer clothing. The shirt was worse than the coat, soaked with blood and stuck to his skin in places where the wound had seeped and dried. Margaret helped him peel it away carefully, trying not to reopen any healing that had begun. When his torso was finally bare, she could see the full extent of the damage. The bullet had entered below his left shoulder blade and exited through his chest, leaving 2 holes that had bled considerably but appeared to have missed his vital organs. More concerning were the deep bruises that covered his ribs, purple and black marks that spoke of a severe beating. Someone had worked him over thoroughly before he had been shot, and Margaret found herself wondering what Jesse Caldwell had done to earn such violent attention. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she began cleaning the wounds with antiseptic. Jesse gripped the arms of the chair but made no sound as she worked, his jaw clenched tight against the pain. Margaret found herself impressed despite her reservations. She had treated grown men who cried like children over injuries less severe than this. The bullet holes were clean, which was fortunate. The bleeding had mostly stopped, and there were no signs of the infection that could turn a survivable wound into a death sentence. But the bruising told a different story, suggesting internal damage that she couldn't see or treat. Jesse needed a real doctor, preferably one with a hospital and surgical equipment. What he had instead was a woman with basic medical knowledge and a determination not to let him die on her kitchen floor. "You're lucky," she said as she began bandaging the wounds. "The bullet missed your lung and your heart. But you've got broken ribs, maybe internal bleeding. You need to stay still, let your body heal." Jesse laughed, a sound without humor. "Can't stay still. Soon as this storm passes, we have to move. My brothers, they don't negotiate. They see you've helped me. They'll assume you're part of whatever happened back in Pueblo." Margaret's hands stilled on the bandages. "What happened in Pueblo?" "Bank job went wrong. Sheriff was waiting for us, like someone had sent word ahead. We barely got out, and I took a bullet in the confusion." Jesse's eyes were distant, remembering. "Lost our horses, most of our supplies. Been walking for 3 days, trying to make it to the hideout in the mountains. A bank robbery." Margaret absorbed this information with surprising calm, given that she was currently bandaging a bank robber in her kitchen while his armed family rode toward her cabin through a thunderstorm. The rational part of her mind noted that she was now officially harboring a criminal, which would make her an accessory after the fact if the authorities ever learned the truth. But the larger part of her mind was focused on more immediate concerns, like keeping Jesse alive long enough for his brothers to take him away. "Why did you come here?" she asked as she secured the last of the bandages. "Why my cabin specifically?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret wondered if he had fallen asleep from exhaustion. But when she looked at his face, she could see he was still conscious, just thinking carefully about his answer. "We heard about you in Colorado Springs," he said finally. "Woman living alone, keeps to herself, doesn't ask questions. Figured if I could make it here, you might be willing to help without getting the law involved." The words stung more than Margaret had expected. So her carefully cultivated isolation hadn't protected her from notice after all. Somehow her story had become known even among outlaws, the spinster woman who had retreated from civilization, who could be counted on to mind her own business. She wasn't sure if she should be offended or impressed by the accuracy of the assessment. "You figured right," she admitted. "But that was before I knew about your brothers." The first drops of rain began pattering against her windows, light at first but growing heavier. Within minutes, The gentle tapping had become a steady drumming that spoke of a storm settling in for the long haul. Margaret moved to her front window and peered out into the darkness, but the rain had created a curtain that made it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond her porch. "They'll wait until morning now," Jessie said, following her thoughts. "Won't try to ride in this weather, not when they can't see where they're going." Margaret nodded, feeling both relief and dread. The delay would give Jessie time to regain some strength, but it would also give his brothers time to plan whatever they intended to do when they arrived. She had heard stories about outlaw families, the kind of tight-knit groups that operated outside civilization's rules. They protected their own with a fierce loyalty that didn't distinguish between right and wrong, only between family and threat. "What will they do when they get here?" she asked. Jessie was quiet again, and Margaret could see him struggling with the question. When he finally answered, his voice was soft and tired. "Depends on what they think happened. If they believe you helped me willingly, they'll probably thank you and take me away to heal properly. But if they think you forced me to come here, or if they think you're working with whoever betrayed us in Pueblo... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret could imagine the rest well enough. Outlaw justice was swift and final, and it didn't require much evidence to reach a verdict. All it would take was one brother with a suspicious nature, one misinterpreted gesture or word, and she would find herself on the wrong end of their protective instincts. "Then we make sure they understand I helped you willingly," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "We tell them the truth, that you came here hurt and hungry, and I fed you and bandaged your wounds, because it was the right thing to do." Jessie looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, more bitter. The stories made you sound like a woman who hated the world." Margaret considered this, wondering what stories were being told about her in the saloons and trading posts of Colorado. She supposed it made sense that her reputation would be darker than the reality. People always preferred dramatic narratives to simple truths. A woman retreating from love was less interesting than a woman consumed by hatred. "I don't hate the world," she said, moving away from the window to check on her medical supplies. "I just learned that the world doesn't always have room for people like me." "People like you?" "People who make inconvenient choices. People who love the wrong person at the wrong time. People who don't fit into the neat categories that make other people comfortable." Jessie was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "My family... We've been outside those categories for so long. I forgot there were people who got pushed out instead of choosing to leave." Margaret found herself looking at Jessie with new eyes. Beneath the outlaw exterior, the guns, the scars, the casual familiarity with violence, she could see traces of the boy he must have been before life had forced him into this role. Someone who had learned to survive by becoming dangerous, but who still remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable. "How old were you when you joined your brothers?" she asked. 15. Maybe 16. Lost track somewhere along the way. Jesse's fingers traced the edge of his bandages absently. "Our parents died when I was 12. Cholera outbreak in Kansas. After that, it was just us boys trying to make it however we could." Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest, the same one she had experienced when she first saw Jesse collapsed in her yard. It was the recognition of shared loss, the understanding that came from knowing what it felt like to have the foundation of your world crumble and leave you searching for new ground to stand on. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. We made our choices. Some of them were good, some of them weren't. But we stayed together, and that counts for something." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof with the steady rhythm that spoke of a storm that would last through the night. Margaret found herself grateful for the delay, not just because it gave Jesse time to heal, but because it gave her time to understand who she was helping and why. She had acted on instinct when she brought him inside, but now she needed to understand the full scope of what she had committed herself to. "Jesse," she said, settling into the chair across from him, "I need to know when your brothers get here. What exactly are they going to expect from me?" Jesse met her eyes directly, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. "They're going to expect you to account for my condition. If I'm better than when I arrived, they'll see you as a friend. If I'm worse ... double quotes, he shrugged, wincing at the movement. They'll see you as a problem that needs solving." Margaret nodded, understanding the stakes clearly now. She had chosen to help Jesse Caldwell, and that choice had consequences that extended far beyond simply bandaging a wounded stranger. By dawn, she would be judged by men who lived by a code she didn't understand, and her life might depend on how well she could convince them that her intentions had been honorable. But as she looked at Jesse, color returning to his face, strength rebuilding in his voice, she found that she didn't regret her decision. For the first time in 2 years, she had acted on something other than self-preservation. She had seen suffering and chosen to relieve it, had encountered hunger and chosen to feed it. The consequences might be severe, but the action itself had been right. "Then we better make sure you're better by morning," she said, rising to check the pot of stew that had been simmering on her stove throughout their conversation. "Are you hungry enough for something more substantial than bread?" Jesse's smile was the first genuine expression she had seen from him, transforming his face from dangerous to merely young. "Ma'am, I think I could eat just about anything you put in front of me." Margaret ladled stew into a bowl, the rich smell of beef and vegetables filling her small cabin with the promise of warmth and nourishment. As she placed it in front of Jesse, she caught sight of her reflection in the dark window, a woman feeding an outlaw, while his family rode through a storm to find him. It wasn't the life she had planned when she bought this land and built this cabin, but it was the life she was living now. And for the first time in 2 years, Margaret Whitmore felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The storm settled over the mountains with the persistence of something that had traveled far to arrive at this particular place and time. Margaret moved through her cabin with quiet efficiency, banking the fire to last through the night, checking the shutters for leaks, preparing for the kind of weather that could trap people indoors for days. But tonight, being trapped didn't feel like a burden. It felt like borrowed time. Jesse had finished the stew and was sitting straighter in his chair, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him. Color had returned to his face, replacing the deathly pallor that had frightened her when she first brought him inside. The food and warmth were working their slow magic, pulling him back from whatever edge he had been walking when he collapsed in her yard. "Tell me about your brothers," Margaret said as she settled into her mending by lamplight. The question was practical. If she was going to face these men at dawn, she needed to understand who they were beyond Jesse's simple description of armed family members seeking their wounded brother. Jesse shifted in his chair, favoring his injured ribs. "There's Marcus. He's the oldest. 32, maybe 33. Been leading us since our parents died. He's careful. Plans everything twice, never takes unnecessary risks. If he's riding hard through this storm, it's because he's convinced something terrible has happened to me." Margaret nodded, filing away the information. A careful leader suggested men who could be reasoned with, who might listen to explanations before reaching for their guns. But it also suggested someone who would be deeply suspicious of coincidences, who would want to understand exactly how his wounded brother had ended up in the care of a stranger. "Then there's Samuel," Jesse continued. 2 years older than me, and the hottest temper you've ever seen. Sam shoots first and asks questions later, especially when family's involved. He's the one you'll need to worry about. The opposite of his older brother, then. Margaret had encountered men like Samuel before, quick to anger, slow to trust, dangerous when they felt cornered or threatened. Such men required careful handling, the kind of delicate conversation that acknowledged their protective instincts, while redirecting their suspicion away from innocent parties. Daniel's the quiet one, Jesse went on. Never says much, but he sees everything. Dan notices details other people miss, like whether someone's lying or whether a situation feels wrong. He's probably the best tracker among us and definitely the best shot. Margaret's hands stilled on her mending. A man who noticed lies was exactly what she didn't need when her story about helping Jesse would need to be carefully constructed. To avoid certain uncomfortable truths, she would have to be particularly cautious around Daniel, making sure her explanations were not just believable, but genuinely honest in every detail she chose to share. "And the youngest is Thomas," Jesse said, then paused, looking at Margaret with sudden awareness. "Tom's only 19, barely old enough to shave properly. He's not really cut out for this life. Too gentle, too trusting. Marcus keeps trying to send him away, find him honest work somewhere, but Tom won't leave the family." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, though she tried not to let it show on her face. Thomas, of all the names Jesse could have mentioned, it had to be the one that carried the weight of her most treasured and painful memories. She wondered if this youngest Caldwell brother shared any qualities with the Thomas she had loved: the gentleness, the healing hands, the way of looking at people that saw their potential rather than their failures. 5 brothers total then, she said, keeping her voice steady. Actually 4 now. We lost William last winter to a fever that just wouldn't break. Will was the one who kept us all laughing, made the hard times easier to bear. Jesse's voice carried a sadness that aged him beyond his years. That's part of why the others are so protective. We can't afford to lose anyone else. Margaret felt the familiar ache of recognition, the way grief could make people desperate, could drive them to hold onto what they had left with a fierceness that bordered on violence. She understood the fear that would be driving Marcus Caldwell through the storm tonight, the terror of losing another brother that would make him suspicious of anyone who had been near Jesse during his vulnerable state. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "Losing family, it changes everything." Jesse studied her face in the lamplight. "You sound like you know something about that." Margaret considered how much to share, weighing the value of honest connection against the safety of maintaining some privacy. But something about the long night ahead, the intimacy of 2 people sheltering from a storm while danger approached, made careful distance feel less important than simple truth. "I lost someone important to me a few years ago," she said finally. "Not family by blood, but someone who mattered. I understand how protective love can make people." "Is that why you're out here alone? Because of losing someone?" The question was gentle but direct, asked by someone who recognized the particular quality of grief that came from love rather than duty. Margaret found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to answer. "Partly, the world didn't approve of our connection, and after he died, staying where people knew our story became difficult." Jesse was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. When he spoke again, his voice held a new quality of respect. "So you do understand what it's like to be pushed outside the lines everyone else draws. I understand what it's like to love someone you're not supposed to love, and to pay the price for that choice long after the choice stops being yours to make." The confession hung between them in the warm air of the cabin, more honest than anything Margaret had said aloud in 2 years. She had expected to feel exposed, vulnerable, but instead she felt something closer to relief. There was a freedom in speaking the truth to someone who wouldn't judge her for it, who understood what it meant to live outside society's comfortable categories. "My brothers," Jesse said slowly, "they're going to see you as either a threat or an ally. There's not much middle ground with them. But if they understand that you helped me because you know what it's like to be cast out, will that make a difference?" "It might. Marcus especially, he's got a soft spot for people who've been wronged by the world." It's part of why we ended up on this side of the law in the first place. After our parents died, we tried to make it the honest way. Worked farms, hired out for construction, even tried our hand at mining. But when you're 4 orphan boys with no connections and no money, honest work doesn't always pay enough to keep you alive. Margaret could picture it, young men trying to survive in a world that had little patience for their circumstances, taking whatever work they could find, slowly discovering that society's promises of fair treatment for honest effort were less reliable than they had been taught to believe. The slide from desperation to crime was often shorter than people wanted to admit, so you turned to robbing banks, started smaller than that. Stagecoaches, mostly, and only the ones carrying company. Payrolls or government money. We told ourselves we weren't really hurting anyone, just taking from people who had more than they needed. Jesse's laugh was rueful. It's funny how easy it is to justify anything when you're hungry enough. And now? Now we're in too deep to back out. Too many wanted posters with our faces. Too many lawmen who know our names. Even if we wanted to go straight, there's nowhere we could go where someone wouldn't eventually recognize us. Margaret understood the trap he was describing, the way a few wrong choices could narrow your options, until crime became not just a possibility, but the only possibility. It was different from her own situation, but related, the way all forms of exile shared certain common features. Once you were outside the circle of acceptable society, finding your way back in became exponentially more difficult. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Jessie considered the question seriously, staring into the flames of her fireplace as if the answer might be written there. I regret that it had to come to this. I regret that William died before we could find a better way. I regret that Tom's growing up thinking this is normal. He paused. But I don't regret keeping my family together. Whatever else we've done, we've survived as a unit. That counts for something. The loyalty was admirable, even if the methods were questionable. Margaret found herself thinking about the choices people made when the world offered them no good options, about the difference between evil and desperation. Jesse Caldwell was clearly not a saint, but he was also not the heartless criminal she might have expected from his reputation. Thunder rolled across the mountains again. Closer this time, followed by a flash of lightning that briefly illuminated the darkness beyond her windows. The storm was intensifying rather than passing through, which meant Jesse's brothers would be taking shelter somewhere, waiting for dawn before attempting to ride through the rough terrain that led to her cabin. Where will they wait? Margaret asked, moving to add another log to the fire. There's an old mining camp about 5 miles south of here. Abandoned buildings, but the roofs are mostly intact. That's where I was trying to reach when I collapsed. Jesse shifted in his chair, testing his strength. They'll hole up there until first light, then come looking for me. 5 miles through mountain terrain in a storm would take experienced riders at least an hour in good weather, longer in these conditions. Margaret calculated that they had perhaps 6 hours before the Caldwell brothers arrived at her door. 6 hours to prepare for a confrontation that could go very wrong very quickly. What should I expect when they get here? She asked. How will they approach? Carefully. They'll scout the area first, make sure it's not a trap. Daniel will circle around behind the cabin while Marcus and Sam approach from the front. Tom will stay with the horses, ready to run if things go bad. Jesse's voice carried the authority of someone who had participated in such operations many times. They won't come in shooting, but they'll be ready to if they don't like what they see. Margaret nodded, appreciating the tactical information. It was better to know what to expect than to be surprised by the careful paranoia of men who had survived by assuming the worst about every situation. And what will they be looking for specifically? Signs of struggle. Evidence that you forced me to come here, or that you're working with whoever betrayed us in Pueblo. They'll want to see my wounds, make sure you didn't make them worse. Jesse met her eyes directly. They'll also want to understand why a respectable woman living alone would help an outlaw, instead of turning him away or sending for the sheriff. It was a fair question, one that Margaret wasn't entirely sure she could answer in a way that would satisfy suspicious men looking for deception. The truth was complicated, that she had helped Jesse because she recognized something in his desperation that reminded her of her own isolation, because she understood what it felt like to be judged by circumstances beyond your control. Because the simple act of mercy had awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. But the truth, she was learning, was often less believable than fiction. Men like the Caldwell brothers would be more likely to accept a simple story than a complex one, more inclined to trust clear motivations than nuanced emotions. What reason would they find most convincing? She asked. Jesse studied her face thoughtfully. The truth, probably. That you're a woman who knows what it's like to be cast out, who helped me because you understood what it meant to be desperate. And alone, he paused. They'll see the medical supplies, the way you bandaged my wounds. They'll know you have some knowledge of healing. It won't be hard to convince them that you acted out of compassion rather than calculation. Margaret hoped. He was right. She had learned to read people fairly well during her years of navigating the complex social dynamics of Cedar Falls, but outlaw families operated by different rules than small-town society. What seemed reasonable to her might appear suspicious to men who had learned to distrust anything that seemed too convenient or too kind. There's something else, Jesse said, his voice growing serious. My brothers. They're going to want to repay your kindness somehow. It's a matter of honor with them. They don't like owing debts, especially to people who've risked themselves to help their family. I don't want payment. I just want them to take you somewhere safe to heal properly. I know that, and you know that, but they won't see it that way. In their world, every favor comes with a price, and people who claim they want nothing are usually lying about their real motives. Jesse leaned forward slightly, wincing at the movement. You'll need to let them give you something: money, protection, whatever they offer. If you refuse, they'll think you're planning to hold the debt over them later. Margaret absorbed this information with growing unease. She had imagined that helping Jesse would be a simple transaction. She would bandage his wounds, feed him, and send him on his way with his family. The idea that she would become permanently entangled with the Caldwell brothers, that they would feel obligated to maintain some kind of ongoing relationship with her, was deeply unsettling. What kind of protection? She asked. Could be anything. Maybe they'll check on you periodically, make sure you're safe and supplied. Maybe they'll put word out that you're under their protection, which would keep other outlaws from bothering you. Or maybe they'll just leave money and consider the debt paid. None of these options appealed to Margaret, who had built her life around the principle of independence and self-sufficiency. The last thing she wanted was to become known as someone with connections to criminal families, or to have armed men treating her cabin as a regular stop on their travels. But she was beginning to understand that what she wanted might be less important than what the situation demanded. By choosing to help Jesse, she had stepped into a world with its own rules and obligations, a world where kindness created bonds that couldn't be easily broken. And if I try to refuse their gratitude, then they'll assume you're planning something. That requires you to appear innocent later. They'll become suspicious, maybe violent. Trust me, it's better to accept whatever they offer and let them feel like the debt is settled. Margaret nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in Jesse's advice even as she disliked the implications. She had learned to navigate one set of social rules during her years in Cedar Falls, but this was different territory entirely. Here, kindness was viewed with suspicion unless it came with a clear price tag, and independence was seen as a potential threat rather than a virtue. The wind howled around the cabin with renewed force, and Margaret could hear debris hitting her shutters, branches torn loose by the storm, perhaps, or stones kicked up by the fierce gusts. The violence of the weather seemed to match the violence of the situation she found herself in, as if the natural world was reflecting the human drama being played out within her walls. "Try to get some rest," she told Jesse, rising to bank the fire for the night. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." "What about you? Aren't you going to sleep?" Margaret looked toward her bedroom door, then back at Jesse. The truth was that she doubted she would be able to sleep, knowing that armed men were riding toward her cabin through the storm. But more than that, she felt responsible for Jesse's safety now that she had taken him in. If his condition worsened during the night, she wanted to be awake to help. "I'll rest here," she said, settling into her chair with a blanket. "In case you need anything." Jesse watched her arrange the blanket around herself, and she could see him struggling with something: gratitude, perhaps, or the unfamiliar experience of being cared for by someone who expected nothing in return. "Margaret," he said quietly, using her name for the first time since she had told it to him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know what you've done tonight. It matters. Not just the food and the bandages, but the way you've treated me. Like I'm still human, despite everything." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. She had spent 2 years believing that her capacity for kindness had been damaged beyond repair, that the bitterness of her exile had poisoned whatever gentleness she had once possessed. But tonight, sitting in her cabin with a wounded outlaw while his family rode through a storm to find him, she felt more like herself than she had since Thomas died. "You are human," she said simply. "Whatever choices you've made, whatever you've done to survive, you're still human. That doesn't change." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I hope my brothers see that too." Margaret pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders and settled in to wait for dawn. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside her cabin, something had shifted. She was no longer alone with her exile and her memories. For better or worse, she had become part of something larger, a story that would play out at sunrise when 4 desperate men arrived to reclaim their wounded brother. As she listened to Jesse's breathing slow into the rhythms of sleep, Margaret found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure was still listening, not for her own safety, though that would be welcome, but for the wisdom to navigate the morning ahead with grace. She had opened her door to a stranger in need, and now she would have to live with whatever consequences that choice had set in motion. But as she sat in the warm glow of her fireplace, watching over a young man who had been given a second chance at life by something as simple as bread and kindness, Margaret Whitmore discovered that she didn't regret her choice. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight she had remembered who she was beneath the layers of isolation and grief. Tonight, she was useful. Tonight, she mattered. And that was worth whatever price the dawn might demand. The storm broke just before sunrise, as if the mountains themselves had decided it was time for the night's drama to reach its conclusion. Margaret woke from a restless doze to the sound of water dripping from her roof and the gentle patter of rain that had lost its fury. Through her window, she could see gray light beginning to creep across the sky, painting the world in shades of silver and possibility. Jesse was already awake, sitting straighter in his chair than he had managed the night before. The rest and food had worked their restorative magic. His color was better, his breathing easier, and there was an alertness in his eyes that spoke of a young man who had stepped back from death's threshold. But Margaret could also see tension in the way he held his shoulders, the way his gaze kept drifting toward the window that faced south. "How long do we have?" she asked, rising to stoke the fire back to life. "Not long. They'll move as soon as there's enough light to see the trail safely." Jesse tested his range of motion carefully, wincing only slightly as he turned his head. "Maybe an hour, if we're lucky." Margaret moved through her morning routine with deliberate calm, preparing coffee and checking her appearance in the small mirror above her wash basin. She wanted to look respectable but not wealthy, helpful but not desperate for approval. The impression she made in the first few moments would determine whether the Caldwell brothers saw her as friend or foe. "There's something I need to tell you," Jesse said as she handed him a cup of coffee. "About why we were in Pueblo, why the bank job went wrong." Margaret paused in her own coffee preparation, hearing something in his voice that hadn't been there. The night before a weight that went beyond physical pain. "We weren't just robbing the bank for money," Jesse continued. "We were trying to get information. Records about what happened to our parents. Documents that might prove they didn't die of cholera like everyone said." The words hit Margaret like cold water. She had assumed the Caldwell brothers were common criminals, driven by poverty and desperation into a life of robbery. But this suggested something far more complex, a family quest for truth that had led them into increasingly dangerous territory. "What do you mean they didn't die of cholera?" Jesse's jaw tightened. "Our father was a county clerk in Kansas, kept records of land sales and property transfers. Right before he died, he started asking questions about some irregular transactions, government land being sold to private buyers for prices that didn't make sense. He thought someone was stealing from the territorial fund." Margaret felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Corruption in territorial governments was common knowledge, but actually proving it was dangerous work that often ended badly for the investigators. 3 days after he started asking questions, our whole family came down with what the doctor called cholera. But the symptoms weren't quite right, and nobody else in town got sick. William was the only one who recovered besides us boys, and he was never the same afterward. Weak lungs, memory problems. Jesse's voice grew bitter. Took us years to figure out it wasn't cholera at all. "Poison," Margaret said quietly, understanding now why 4 orphan boys had turned to crime. They weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to find justice in a world where the law had failed them. The bank in Pueblo had copies of those land records, locked in their vault. We thought if we could get them, we might finally be able to prove what really happened. Jesse stared into his coffee cup, but someone was waiting for us. Someone who knew exactly when we'd be there and what we were after. The implications were staggering. If Jesse was telling the truth, the Caldwell brothers weren't just outlaws, they were the survivors of a murdered family, seeking evidence that could expose high-level corruption. The men riding toward her cabin weren't just desperate criminals. They were the last witnesses to a crime that powerful people wanted buried. "Who else knew about your plan?" "Nobody. We kept it within the family, didn't even tell our usual contacts. That's what has Marcus so spooked. If someone betrayed us, it had to be someone close enough to know our business." Jesse looked at her directly. "That's why they're going to be especially suspicious of you. A convenient stranger appearing just when I needed help. It fits the pattern of someone trying to get close to us." Margaret felt her stomach clench with new anxiety. She had thought the morning's challenge would be convincing 4 protective brothers that she meant no harm to their family. But if they suspected her of being connected to whoever had betrayed them in Pueblo, if they thought she might be part of a larger conspiracy, double quotes, what can I do to convince them I'm not involved? Tell them the truth. All of it. About why you're here, about the man you lost, about why you chose to help me. They'll know if you're lying, and they'll respect honesty even if they don't like what they hear. Before Margaret could respond, she heard it, the distant sound of horses moving carefully through wet terrain. Jesse heard it too, his body tensing. Despite his injuries, they were coming. Margaret moved to her window and peered through the curtain. 4 riders were approaching from the south, picking their way carefully around the puddles and mud left by the storm. Even at this distance, she could see they rode with the practiced wariness of men who expected trouble around every corner. "That's them," Jesse confirmed, though he didn't need to look. "Remember, they're scared for me, angry about the betrayal, and suspicious of everyone. But they're not evil men. Give them a chance to understand who you are." Margaret squared her shoulders and moved toward her door. She had spent 2 years hiding from the world, avoiding complications and human entanglements. Now she was about to face 4 armed men whose first instinct would be to distrust her motives and question her story. But as she placed her hand on the door handle, she found that fear was only part of what she felt. There was also anticipation, the sense that this moment would determine not just her immediate safety, but the direction of her life going forward. She opened the door and stepped onto her porch, making herself visible to the approaching riders. It was important that they see her clearly, that she appear calm and unthreatening. Running or hiding would only confirm their suspicions. The 4 men reined in their horses about 50 yards from her cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough to react if the situation turned dangerous. Margaret could see them clearly now. 3 of them matched Jesse's descriptions perfectly. Marcus sat on his horse with the easy authority of someone accustomed to command, his eyes already scanning her property for signs of threat or deception. Samuel's hand rested on his gun butt, and there was a coiled tension in his posture that spoke of barely controlled aggression. Daniel had already begun circling toward the back of her cabin, just as Jesse had predicted. But it was the 4th rider who captured Margaret's attention, young Thomas Caldwell, barely 19, with a face that still held traces of boyish softness. Despite the hard life he'd chosen, he stayed with the horses as his brothers dismounted, but Margaret could see the worry in his expression, the fear that they might be too late to save Jesse. "Ma'am," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "We're looking for our brother. Young man, dark hair, might be hurt. You seen anyone like that?" Margaret had rehearsed this moment during the long night, but facing the reality of 4 armed men evaluating her, every word was different from imagining it. She could feel their attention like a physical weight, could sense Samuel's hair trigger, temper, and Daniel's calculating assessment of her body language. "Yes," she called back, keeping her voice steady. "He's inside. He's hurt, but he's alive." The relief that passed over their faces was unmistakable, followed immediately by renewed suspicion. Marcus dismounted and took several steps closer, his brothers flanking him but keeping their weapons holstered. "What's his condition?" Marcus asked. "Bullet wound through the chest, several broken ribs, exhaustion, and blood loss. I've cleaned and bandaged the wounds, given him food and rest. He's much stronger than when he arrived." "When did he arrive?" This from Samuel, his voice sharp with suppressed anger. "Last evening, just before the storm hit. He collapsed in my yard." Daniel had completed his circuit of her property and rejoined his brothers, giving Marcus a subtle nod that Margaret interpreted as confirmation that there were no hidden threats, no signs of an ambush waiting. "You mind if we see him?" Marcus asked, though it was clearly not really a request. "Of course. But please, he's healing well, but he still needs rest and quiet." Margaret led them into her cabin, acutely aware of how small the space felt with 4 additional people in it. Jesse looked up as they entered, and the joy and relief on his face at seeing his brothers alive and safe was so genuine that Margaret felt some of her own tension ease. Whatever else these men might be, their love for each other was real. "Jesus, Jesse," Samuel breathed, taking in his brother's bandaged condition. "We thought, when we found your horse shot dead in blood all over the rocks. I'm all right, Sam. This lady Margaret, she saved my life." Jesse's voice was stronger than it had been the night before, and Margaret was grateful to hear the genuine warmth in it. When he spoke her name, Marcus was examining Jesse's bandages with the careful attention of someone who had treated battlefield wounds before. "This is good work," he said, glancing at Margaret with something that might have been respect. "You have medical training?" "Some. My father was a doctor, and I learned from him. I've treated wounds before." "Not many people would take in a stranger with a bullet hole," Daniel observed quietly. His voice was soft, but Margaret could hear the question underneath it. "Doc, this was the moment. Jesse had warned her about the moment when she would need to explain her motivations in a way that satisfied their suspicions while remaining truthful. Margaret had decided during the long night to follow Jesse's advice and tell them the real story, trusting that honesty would serve her better than carefully constructed lies. "I know what it's like to be cast out," she said simply. "To need help and have nowhere to turn. When I saw your brother hurt and alone, I couldn't turn him away." "Cast out from what?" Samuel's question was blunt, aggressive. Margaret met his eyes directly. "I had a relationship with a married man. When he died, the town decided I was a scandal they couldn't tolerate. I came here to get away from their judgment." The brothers exchanged glances, and Margaret could see them processing this information. In their world, being outside society's rules was normal rather than shameful. If anything, her confession would make her more trustworthy in their eyes, not less. "That's why you live alone out here?" Thomas asked, speaking for the first time. His voice was gentler than his brother's, carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "That's why I came here originally. I stay because I found peace in solitude." Marcus was still studying her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. "You could have sent for the sheriff when you found Jesse. Why didn't you?" Margaret had expected this question and had her answer ready. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted by people who think they're doing the right thing. Sometimes the law isn't the same as justice. And you asked for nothing in return?" Daniel's quiet voice carried a weight of experience that suggested he knew how rarely such kindness came without strings attached. "Nothing except that you take him somewhere safe to heal properly. I'm not equipped to handle complications if his injuries worsen." The brothers were quiet for a moment, digesting her answers. Margaret could see them reaching a consensus without words, the kind of silent communication that came from years of depending on each other for survival. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge of suspicion. "Ma'am, our family owes you a debt we can't easily repay. You've saved Jesse's life, and you've done it without asking for anything in return. That's not something we take lightly." "I don't want payment," Margaret began, but Marcus held up a hand to stop her. "I understand that, and I respect it. But we can't ride away from here knowing we left you unprotected. Word gets around about people who help our kind, and not everyone who hears it will be grateful. Some folks might decide you're a threat that needs eliminating." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on surviving the immediate confrontation that she hadn't considered the longer-term consequences of harboring a wounded outlaw. If people learned that she had aided the Caldwell brothers, her carefully constructed isolation could become a death sentence. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "Protection," Samuel said bluntly. "We make it known that you're under our care. Anyone who bothers you will answer to us. And if I don't want that kind of protection, then you'll be dead within 6 months, Daniel said matter-of-factly. "The people who set us up in Pueblo, they'll hear about you eventually. They'll decide you know too much about their business, even if you don't know anything at all." Margaret looked at Jesse, who nodded grimly. "They're right. By helping me, you've made yourself a target. Like it or not, you're part of this now." The walls of Margaret's carefully ordered world were crumbling around her, revealing a landscape far more dangerous and complex than she had imagined. She had thought that helping one wounded stranger would be a simple act of mercy, quickly completed and easily forgotten. Instead, she had stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that stretched back years and involved people powerful enough to murder an entire family. What would this protection involve? She asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "We check on you periodically," Marcus explained. "Make sure you're safe supplied, not being bothered by anyone who shouldn't be. Here, we put word out through certain channels that this place is off limits. And if you ever need help, real help, you know how to reach us." "In exchange for what?" "Nothing. This isn't a business arrangement, it's a family obligation. You saved Jesse's life, which makes you family as far as we're concerned. Family. The word hit Margaret with unexpected force. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be claimed by people who would stand between her and harm. But the family being offered to her was a dangerous one, built on violence and bound by codes she didn't fully understand. I need time to think about this, she said. Fair enough, Marcus replied. But we can't wait long to move Jesse. The people hunting us won't stay confused about his location forever. Margaret looked at Jesse, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. In the space of 12 hours, he had gone from being a dying stranger to being the catalyst that would reshape her entire life. The choice she made now would determine whether she remained the isolated woman who had opened her door to him, or became something else entirely, a person connected to dangerous forces beyond her control. But as she looked around her cabin at the brothers who had ridden through a storm to save their wounded family member, at the young man whose life she had preserved with nothing more than bread and basic kindness, Margaret realized that her old life of careful isolation was already gone. The moment she had decided to help Jesse Caldwell, she had stepped out of one story and into another. All right, she said quietly. But I want to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to. Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the man he might have been in a different world, someone who protected people instead of robbing them, someone who built communities instead of hiding from them. We'll explain everything, he promised. But first, we need to get Jesse somewhere safer. Can you travel? He asked his youngest brother. Jesse tested his mobility carefully, standing with obvious effort, but managing to stay upright. I can ride if we take it slow. Then we leave within the hour, Marcus decided. Margaret, pack whatever you can't afford to leave behind. You're coming with us until we can figure out how to keep you safe. Margaret stared at him. I'm what? Coming. With us, Samuel repeated, as if it should have been obvious. You think we're going to leave you alone after what you've done? After what you know? Margaret looked around her cabin, her books, her carefully tended garden, her quiet life. That had taken 2 years to build, and realized that none of it mattered anymore. By choosing compassion over caution, by opening her door to a stranger in need, she had irrevocably changed the trajectory of her existence. How long? She asked. Until it's safe, Daniel said. However long that takes. Margaret Whitmore, who had spent 2 years learning to live alone, was about to discover what it meant to be part of a family that lived outside all rules except their own. The woman who had chosen isolation was about to become an outlaw herself, bound to dangerous men by bonds stronger than law or convention. As she began gathering her few precious possessions, Margaret found herself thinking about her Thomas, who had died believing that love was worth any risk. He would have understood why she had helped Jesse, would have approved of her choice to value human life over personal safety. Perhaps he would even have approved of what came next, because Margaret Whitmore was tired of living safely. For 2 years, she had protected herself from further pain by avoiding all possibility of connection or purpose. But in one night of caring for a wounded stranger, she had remembered what it felt like to matter, to be needed, to be part of something larger than her own carefully maintained solitude. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever prices would be demanded. For her moment of mercy, Margaret was ready to pay them. She had been hiding long enough. Margaret packed her life into 2 saddlebags with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that everything left behind might be lost forever. Her hands moved automatically, selecting the medical supplies that had proven so valuable, wrapping her father's instruments in soft cloth, choosing the 3 books that had sustained her through the longest nights of isolation. But her mind was reeling with the magnitude of what she was abandoning. The garden she had coaxed from reluctant soil would wither without her care. The chickens' faith, hope, and charity would need to fend for themselves or become meals for whatever predators discovered their coop unguarded. Patience the goat would likely survive, being ornery enough to discourage most threats, but Margaret found herself mourning the loss of even these simple companionships. "We'll send someone to tend your animals," Marcus said, noticing her hesitation. As she looked toward the chicken coop, "and to watch the property. If this gets resolved quickly, you might be able to come back." The kindness in his voice surprised her. Margaret had expected outlaws to be more callous about such domestic concerns, but Marcus Caldwell spoke like a man who understood what it meant to lose a home. She supposed that anyone who had been driven from normal society would recognize the pain of abandoning a place where you had finally found peace. "What about Mrs. Patterson? She worry when she doesn't see smoke from my chimney." "Who's Mrs. Patterson?" Samuel asked, immediately alert to potential complications. "My nearest neighbor, 8 miles east. She checks on me occasionally, not often, but enough to notice if I simply vanished." The brothers exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of navigating dangers together. Margaret was learning to read these silent conversations, to understand the way information flowed between them without spoken words. "Daniel will ride over. Make sure she knows you've gone to visit family in Denver," Marcus decided. Nothing suspicious, just a woman taking a trip after being alone too long. Margaret nodded, though the deception sat uneasily with her. Mrs. Patterson had been nothing but kind during their limited interactions, and she deserved better than a lie designed to cover Margaret's disappearance. But the alternative telling. The truth would endanger everyone involved, including Mrs. Patterson herself. "How long before someone comes looking for me?" Margaret asked as she secured her belongings to the saddle of the extra horse Thomas had brought for her. "Depends on who's paying attention," Jesse said. He was mounted now, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him to stay upright. Could be weeks, could be months. But someone will notice eventually, and when they do, they'll start asking questions. The horse Thomas had chosen for her was a gentle mare named Stella, old enough to be reliable, but young enough to handle rough terrain. Margaret had learned to ride as a child, but it had been years since she'd spent significant time in the saddle. As they prepared to leave, she found herself hoping that whatever destination the Caldwell brothers had in mind wasn't too many days away. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked as Marcus mounted his own horse. "Hideout in the high country," he replied. "Place we've been using for 3 years now. Remote enough that casual travelers won't stumble across it, but comfortable enough for a longer stay." Margaret looked back at her cabin one last time, memorizing the details she had taken for granted, the way the morning light fell across her small porch, the precise angle of the weather vane her father had made, the neat rows of her garden that would soon surrender to weeds. She had built this life carefully, stone by stone, choosing solitude as protection against further heartbreak. Now she was trading that protection for something far more dangerous and uncertain. But as the small group of riders moved out, following a trail that led north into the mountains, Margaret found that the grief she expected to feel was tempered by something else: anticipation. For 2 years, her days had followed the same predictable pattern, safe and quiet and ultimately empty. Now she was riding into unknown territory with people who lived by completely different rules, and despite the dangers involved, there was something exhilarating about the unpredictability of it all. The trail climbed steadily through forests of pine and aspen, following creek beds and game paths that showed no signs of regular human use. Marcus led the way with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree, while Samuel brought up the rear, constantly checking for signs of pursuit. Daniel rode ahead as a scout, disappearing around bends in the trail and reappearing to signal that the way was clear. Jesse stayed near Margaret, ostensibly to help if she had trouble with her horse, but she suspected he was also serving as her introduction to this new world she was entering. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks and explained the logic behind their route choices, always staying below ridgelines where they might be silhouetted against the sky, avoiding clearings where They could be spotted from a distance, following paths that would be difficult to track. It's like learning a different language, Margaret observed after Jessie had explained why they were taking a longer route around a meadow instead of cutting straight across it. That's exactly what it is, Jessie agreed. The language of staying. Invisible, staying alive. Most people move through the world assuming they're safe, that no one is hunting them. We can't afford to make that assumption. Margaret tried to imagine what it would be like to live with that level of constant vigilance, to evaluate every decision based on whether it might expose you to danger. It was exhausting just to think about, yet the Caldwell brothers had been living this way for years. She found herself developing a new respect for the mental strength required to maintain such wariness without becoming paralyzed by paranoia. The higher they climbed, the more spectacular the scenery became. Margaret had spent 2 years looking at these mountains from below, but experiencing them from within was entirely different. The scale was overwhelming, peaks that disappeared into clouds, valleys that seemed to stretch forever, forests so dense and vast that a person could wander for weeks without finding their way out. "It's beautiful," she said during a brief rest stop beside a crystal-clear stream. "It's also deadly if you don't know what you're doing," Samuel observed, though not unkindly. "Weather can change in minutes up here. One wrong turn can leave you lost for days. And then there are the animals: bears, mountain lions, wolves that don't care much whether you're armed or not." Margaret absorbed this information while refilling her water bottle from the stream. She was beginning to understand that survival in this environment required skills she had never needed to develop: reading weather patterns, tracking abilities, the kind of wilderness knowledge that meant the difference between life and death when civilization was days away. "We'll teach you," Thomas said quietly, noticing her concerned expression. "Everything you need to know to be safe up here. It's not as complicated as it sounds once you understand the basics." His kindness reminded Margaret painfully of the other Thomas, the one who had tried to teach her surgical techniques with the same patient encouragement. But this Thomas was barely 19, his gentleness still untested by the full weight of the life he'd chosen. Margaret found herself hoping that his brother's protection would keep that gentleness intact, that the violence of their world wouldn't eventually harden him beyond recognition. They rode for most of the day, stopping frequently to rest the horses and allow Jessie to recover from the exertion. Margaret was grateful for these breaks, as her own endurance was being tested by hours in the saddle after 2 years of largely sedentary living. But she was determined not to slow them down or become a burden that might endanger their safety. As afternoon faded toward evening, the character of the landscape began to change. The trees grew larger and more ancient, creating a canopy so thick that the forest floor remained dim even in full daylight. The air grew cooler and thinner, carrying scents of pine resin and wildflowers that Margaret had never encountered at lower elevations. "Almost there," Marcus announced as they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. "Another hour, maybe 2. Margaret tried to spot their destination in the vast wilderness spread out below them, but saw nothing that looked like human habitation. The entire landscape appeared untouched, as if they were the first people ever to venture into this remote corner of the mountains. "Where exactly is there?" she asked. "You'll see," Jessie said with the first genuine smile she had seen from him since his brothers arrived. "It's not what you'd expect from an outlaw hideout." The trail descended into a narrow canyon carved by centuries of snowmelt and seasonal floods. The walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural corridor that would be nearly impossible to attack and equally difficult to escape from. Margaret realized with growing unease that anyone entering this canyon would be completely at the mercy of whoever controlled the high ground. "Relax," Daniel said, apparently reading her thoughts. "We've got lookouts posted on the rim. If anyone was following us, we'd know about it long before they got this far." The canyon curved and twisted. For what felt like miles, the walls growing higher and more imposing as they progressed deeper into the mountain. Just when Margaret was beginning to wonder if they were lost, the passage opened into a hidden valley that took her breath away. The space was larger than she had expected, perhaps half a mile wide and twice as long, completely enclosed by towering cliffs that would be impossible to scale without ropes and considerable expertise. A stream meandered through the center of the valley, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall in a silver ribbon. Meadows dotted with wildflowers spread out from the water's edge, while groves of aspen and pine provided natural windbreaks and privacy. But what surprised Margaret most were the buildings. Instead of the rough shacks or tents she had expected, the valley contained several well-constructed log cabins, a barn, corrals for horses, and what appeared to be a workshop or smithy. Gardens had been planted and tended, and she could see livestock grazing in the distance. It looked less like a criminal hideout than a prosperous frontier settlement. "Who built all this?" she asked, amazed by the scope of the development. "We did," Marcus replied with obvious pride. "Took us 3 years, working whenever we could spare the time from other activities. But we needed a place that could sustain us long term, somewhere we could retreat when things got too hot elsewhere. How many people live here?" "Depends on the season and what's happening in the outside world. Right now, it's just us and a few allies who help maintain the place. But we've had as many as 20 people here at once, other families like ours, people who needed a place to disappear." For a while, Margaret was beginning to understand that the Caldwell brothers had created something unique in this hidden valley, a community of outcasts, a place where people who lived outside the law could find safety and support. It was simultaneously impressive and troubling, representing both remarkable ingenuity and a complete rejection of conventional society. As they rode into the settlement, figures emerged from the various buildings to greet them. Margaret counted 6 people besides the Caldwell brothers, 3 men and 3 women, ranging in age from teenage to middle-aged. All were armed, and all watched her with the careful attention of people accustomed to evaluating strangers for potential threats. "This is Margaret," Marcus announced to the assembled group. "She saved Jesse's life and took a considerable risk to help our family. She's under our protection now." The introduction was simple but effective. Margaret could see the visible relaxation in posture as the residents processed this information, shifting from wariness to curiosity. A middle-aged woman with graying hair stepped forward first. "I'm Catherine Murphy," she said, extending a weathered hand to Margaret. "I run the medical facility here, such as it is. I'd like to take a look at Jesse's wounds, make sure they're healing properly." "I'm not a trained doctor," Margaret said quickly. "I just did what I could with basic supplies. From what I can see, you did excellent work. But it's always good to have a second opinion on bullet wounds." Catherine's smile was warm and genuine. "We'll get you settled first, then tend to medical matters." Margaret was shown to a small but comfortable cabin that apparently served as guest quarters for people seeking temporary refuge in the valley. The interior was simply furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace, a comfortable bed, and windows that offered views of the meadow and stream. After 2 years of living alone in her isolated cabin, the prospect of having neighbors, even outlaw neighbors, felt both comforting and overwhelming. As evening fell, the residents of the valley gathered in the largest cabin for a communal meal. Margaret found herself seated between Thomas and Catherine, gradually learning the stories of the people who had found refuge in this hidden place. There was Henry Blackwood, whose farm had been stolen by a corrupt banker. Sarah Chun, whose husband had been murdered by claim jumpers while the law looked the other way. Robert Clearwater, whose Lakota heritage had made him a target for vigilantes seeking to enforce their version of racial justice. Each story was different, but they all shared common elements: people who had been failed by the legal system, who had turned to the Caldwell brothers' protection when conventional justice proved inadequate or corrupt. Margaret began to understand that what she had stumbled into wasn't simply a criminal organization, but an alternative community built around mutual aid and shared rejection of a society that had rejected them first. "What about you?" Sarah asked as the meal wound down. "What brought you to Jesse's attention?" Margaret found herself telling her story again: the love affair with Thomas, the scandal, the exile to her mountain cabin. But here, among people who had all been cast out for various reasons, her tale provoked sympathy rather than judgment. These were people who understood what it meant to be declared unacceptable by respectable society. "The thing that always amazes me," Catherine observed, "is how quick people are to condemn others for loving the wrong person while tolerating the most obvious corruption and cruelty as long as it's done by the right people." "Speaking of corruption," Marcus interjected, "we need to discuss what happened in Pueblo. Margaret deserves to know what she's gotten herself involved in." The atmosphere in the room grew serious as the Caldwell brothers recounted the details of their failed bank robbery, the ambush that had been waiting for them, and their growing certainty that someone with inside knowledge had betrayed their plans. Margaret listened with growing alarm as she realized the scope of the conspiracy they were fighting: a network of corrupt officials, businessmen, and lawmen who had been stealing from territorial funds for years. "The records we were trying to get would have proved everything," Samuel explained. "Names, dates, amounts stolen. Enough evidence to bring down a dozen powerful men and maybe get justice for our parents. But now they know we're onto them," Daniel added quietly, "which means they'll be taking steps to protect themselves. Eliminating witnesses, destroying evidence, including anyone who might have helped us," Jesse finished, looking directly at Margaret. "That's why you can't go back to your old life. They'll assume you know more than you do, and they'll act accordingly." Margaret absorbed this information with a mixture of fear and anger. By choosing to help one wounded stranger, she had inadvertently made herself an enemy of people who had already committed murder to protect their secrets. The life she had built in her mountain cabin was gone not just temporarily, but permanently. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out who betrayed us," Marcus replied grimly. "And then we make sure they can't do it again." Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her unlikely protectors, realizing that her story was now permanently intertwined with theirs. She had fed a dying outlaw her last bread, and in return had been given something she hadn't even known she was missing: a purpose larger than her own survival, and a family bound together not by blood, but by shared exile from a world that had no place for them. As the group began to disperse for the evening, Margaret stepped outside to look up at the stars visible through the rim of the canyon walls. For 2 years, she had watched these same constellations from her cabin porch, feeling isolated and forgotten. Now she was seeing them from a hidden valley filled with people who understood what it meant to be cast out. And despite the dangers that lay ahead, she felt less alone than she had in years. That tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new dangers. But tonight, Margaret Whitmore was exactly where she belonged, among the unwanted, the exiled, the people who had learned to create their own version of home in the spaces between the world's expectations. She had fed a dying outlaw, and in return had found her way back to herself. Margaret woke to the sound of axes biting into wood and the distant lowing of cattle being moved to pasture. Through her cabin window, she could see the hidden valley coming alive with the rhythms of a working community, people tending gardens, mending equipment, preparing for another day of maintaining their sanctuary in the wilderness. It was a far cry from the solitary silence she had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. Jesse knocked on her door as she was braiding her hair, looking stronger than he had since collapsing in her yard 3 days earlier. The color had returned to his face, and he moved with only slight stiffness from his healing ribs. "Catherine wants to check your medical supplies," he said. She's impressed with how you handled my wounds, thinks we might benefit from your knowledge." Margaret gathered her father's instruments and the remaining bandages from her pack, curious to see what passed for medical facilities in an outlaw stronghold. Catherine led her to a cabin that had been converted into a surprisingly well-equipped clinic, complete with surgical tools, bottles of medicines, and shelves lined with dried herbs and tinctures. "We see our share of injuries up here," Catherine explained as she examined Margaret's instruments with professional interest. "Gunshot wounds, broken bones, fevers that won't break. Having someone with formal medical training makes a real difference between life and death sometimes." Margaret ran her fingers over the familiar weight of her father's bone saw, remembering the countless hours she had spent learning to use these tools under his patient guidance. "My father always said that healing was both an art and a science. You need the knowledge to understand what's wrong, but also the instinct to know when to deviate from textbook procedures. Your instincts were certainly sound with Jesse. That bullet could have caused internal bleeding if you hadn't cleaned the wound so thoroughly." Catherine paused in her examination of a set of forceps. "We could use someone with your skills here permanently. The valley's growing, and with growth comes more medical needs." The suggestion caught Margaret off guard. She had been thinking of her stay in the valley as temporary, a brief refuge until the danger from the Pueblo conspiracy passed. But Catherine was suggesting something entirely different, a permanent role, a way to contribute meaningfully to this unusual community. "I'm not a licensed physician," Margaret protested. "I never completed formal training." "Neither did I," Catherine replied with a wry smile. "Learned everything I know from necessity and experience. But formal training doesn't matter much out here. What matters is whether you can save lives when it counts." Before Margaret could respond, Samuel burst through the clinic door with blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. "Had a disagreement with a low-hanging branch while checking the perimeter," he said, though his sheepish expression suggested there was more to the story. Margaret found herself moving automatically, guiding Samuel to the examination table and beginning to clean the wound while Catherine gathered supplies. The injury was messy but not serious, a scalp wound that bled dramatically but would heal cleanly with proper stitching. "Hold still," Margaret instructed as she prepared to suture the cut. "This is going to sting." Samuel sat motionless while she worked, though she could see him studying her technique with professional interest. "You've got steady hands," he observed. "Most people get nervous working on someone they know might shoot them if they make a mistake. Are you planning to shoot me if I make a mistake?" Margaret asked, drawing the needle through his skin with practiced precision. "Hadn't planned on it, but the day's still young." Margaret found herself laughing despite the circumstances. Samuel's dry humor was growing on her, reminding her that beneath the dangerous exterior, these men were still fundamentally human. They joked, worried about each other, felt pain and fear like anyone else. "There," she said, tying off the final suture. "Try not to antagonize any more trees today." "Can't make promises about that. Trees up here are ornery as hell." As Samuel left the clinic, Catherine turned to Margaret with an approving nod. "That was well done. Clean technique, appropriate suture spacing, good wound management. You've definitely had proper training." Margaret cleaned her instruments while considering Catherine's earlier suggestion about staying permanently. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it offered purpose and community. Terrifying because it meant fully embracing a life outside the law. "What would it mean exactly?" she asked. "To stay, I mean. What would be expected of me?" "Nothing more than what you just did. Tend injuries, treat illnesses, help people heal. The only difference is that your patients would be people society has declared criminals." Catherine's voice grew serious. "I won't lie to you, it's not an easy life. We live with constant uncertainty, always ready to abandon everything if we're discovered. But there's also a freedom in it that most people never experience." "What?" Kind of freedom. The freedom to be judged by your actions rather than your past. To find purpose in helping people who have nowhere else to turn. To be part of something that matters, even if the outside world would never understand it. Margaret thought about her life in the isolated cabin, safe, predictable, and ultimately meaningless. She had spent 2 years protecting herself from further pain, but in doing so, she had also protected herself from any possibility of joy or purpose. Here in the valley, she was being offered the chance to matter again, to use her skills in service of something larger than her own survival. "I'll need time to decide," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But know that you already have a place here if you want it." Margaret spent the rest of the morning exploring the valley, marveling at the ingenuity and industry that had created this hidden community. The gardens were extensive and well-planned, designed to provide fresh vegetables throughout the growing season. The workshop contained tools for metalworking, woodworking, and leather crafting, everything needed to maintain equipment and create new supplies without depending on outside sources. Henry Blackwood found her examining the water system that channeled the stream to provide fresh water for all the buildings. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said, following her gaze along the carefully constructed channels. "Marcus designed the whole thing. Man's got an engineer's mind when it comes to solving practical problems. How long did this all take to build?" 3 years of steady work, plus another year of planning and preparation. "We started with nothing but the natural advantages of the location, the hidden entrance, the water source, the defensible position. Everything else had to be hauled in piece by piece or built from scratch." Margaret tried to imagine the enormous effort involved in creating this settlement, the countless trips to transport materials, the careful planning required to make everything work together, the physical labor of construction in such a remote location. It represented a level of commitment that went far beyond simple criminal activity. "Why here specifically? What made you choose this valley?" Henry's expression grew thoughtful. "Marcus found it while they were running from a posse about 4 years ago. Hidden entrance, good water, natural defenses, but more than that, it felt right. Like a place where people could start over, build something better than what they'd left behind. And it works? Living here, I mean. Better than anything I ever had in the outside world. Out there, I was just another farmer trying to scrape by while rich men stole everything I built. Here, my work matters. What I grow feeds people who depend on me, people who would do the same for me if I needed it." Margaret could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the pride of someone who had found meaningful work after years of struggle. It was the same tone she had heard from Catherine when discussing the medical clinic, the sense of purpose that came from contributing to something worthwhile. As afternoon approached, she found herself drawn to the central gathering area where several valley residents were engaged in various activities. Sarah Chun was teaching young Thomas to read Chinese characters, using brush and ink to create elegant symbols on rice paper. Robert Clearwater was working on what appeared to be a detailed map, marking trails and landmarks with precise notations. "Escape routes," he explained when Margaret expressed curiosity about the map. "We need to know every way out of these mountains, in case we ever have to leave quickly. I've been exploring and charting the terrain for months. How many routes are there?" 7 that I've found so far, though 3 of them would be difficult in winter conditions. The goal is to have options, different paths for different circumstances, different destinations depending on where the threats are coming from." Margaret studied the map, impressed by the detail and forethought it represented. Every aspect of life in the valley seemed to be planned with escape in mind, a constant awareness that their sanctuary could be discovered at any time. It was a sobering reminder of the precarious nature of their existence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Robert. "Choosing this life over trying to work within the system?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "The system wanted me dead for the crime of being born." Lakota. My choice was to come here or to die fighting a war I couldn't win. Given those options, I'd say I chose well. His words reminded Margaret that for many of the valley residents, outlawry wasn't a choice made from greed or desire for adventure. It was survival, pure and simple. They were people who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable society and had found a way to create their own version of civilization in the spaces between. As evening approached, Margaret joined the communal dinner preparation, helping Catherine and Sarah prepare a meal for the entire community. The work was familiar and comforting, reminding her of helping her mother in the kitchen years before tragedy and scandal had changed the trajectory of her life. "You fit in well here," Sarah observed as they worked together to prepare vegetables for the stew. "Most people who come from outside take longer to adjust to community living." "I lived alone for 2 years," Margaret replied. "I'd forgotten how pleasant it could be to have company for simple tasks." "What was it like? Living completely alone, I mean?" Margaret considered the question while stirring the pot. "Peaceful but empty, safe but meaningless. I thought I wanted solitude, but what I really wanted was just to be left alone by people who had already decided what to think about me. And now I'm not sure what I want. This place, these people, it's all so different from anything I ever imagined for myself." Sarah nodded understandingly. "I felt the same way when I first arrived. The adjustment from trying to live respectably to embracing outlaw life. It's not easy. But there's something liberating about finally accepting that you don't have to prove yourself worthy of society's approval." The dinner conversation that evening was lively and wide-ranging, covering everything from plans for expanding the gardens to discussions of political developments in the territorial capital. Margaret was struck by how well-informed the valley residents were about outside events, despite their isolation. "We maintain contacts in several towns," Marcus explained when she commented on this. "People who send us news and supplies in exchange for protection or assistance. Information is just as valuable as gold when you're living outside the law." "What kind of assistance?" Margaret asked. "Depends on the situation. Sometimes it's just a show of force to discourage someone from bothering our friends. Sometimes it's more direct intervention in cases where the law won't or can't help." Margaret sensed there were layers of meaning in Marcus's carefully chosen words, implications about activities that the valley residents engaged in beyond simple self-preservation. But she also sensed that she wasn't ready to hear the full truth about how this community sustained itself and protected its interests. After dinner, she found herself sitting by the stream with Jesse, watching the last light fade from the canyon rim above them. His recovery had been remarkable. Within days, he had gone from dying to nearly full strength, a testament to both his youth and Margaret's medical care. "Thank you," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Not just for saving my life, but for everything that's happened since. You could have turned us away this morning, could have refused to come here. Instead, you trusted us enough to leave everything behind. I didn't really have a choice, did I? You said to yourself that going back wasn't an option. There's always a choice. You could have taken your chances with the law, could have tried to convince them you were an innocent victim. Probably would have worked. Too respectable woman, good reputation, no criminal connections." Margaret shook her head. "Not respectable enough. My reputation was already damaged before any of this started. And besides, I saw how you all care for each other. That's not something you find in many places." "Family," Jesse said simply. "Not by blood, necessarily, but family all the same. People who will stand between you and whatever threatens you, no matter what it costs them. Is that what I am now?" "Family?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "That's up to you. We've claimed you as family, but being family is a choice you have to make for yourself. It means accepting responsibility for everyone else's welfare, means being willing to sacrifice for the group when necessary. And if I choose not to, If I decide this life isn't for me, then we help you find somewhere safe to start over. New identity, new location, whatever you need to disappear completely. We take care of our own, even if they choose to leave. Margaret appreciated the honesty of his answer, the lack of pressure or manipulation. These people were offering her genuine choice, not trying to trap her into a decision through fear or obligation. I keep thinking about something Catherine said earlier, Margaret mused. About the freedom to be judged by your actions rather than your past. I spent 2 years hiding from my past, trying to pretend it didn't define me. But maybe the answer isn't to hide from it. Maybe it's to find people who don't care about it. Sounds like you're talking yourself into staying. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just talking myself into admitting that I belong here more than I ever belonged anywhere else. Jessie smiled. Either way, you're welcome for as long as you want to stay. And if you do decide to make this permanent, I think you'll find there's more satisfaction in this life than you might expect. Even with the constant danger, the uncertainty, especially because of those things. When you know that everything could change in an instant, you learn to appreciate what you have while you have it. Food tastes better. Friendships matter more. Every day feels like a gift instead of an obligation. Margaret considered his words as she watched the stars appear one by one in the narrow strip of sky visible above the canyon walls. For 2 years, she had lived each day as a repetition of the last, safe but fundamentally meaningless. Here in the valley, surrounded by people who had chosen exile over submission, she felt more alive than she had since Thomas's death. I want to try, she said finally. I want to see if I can build something worthwhile here. Jessie reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Welcome to the family, Margaret Whitmore. I think you're going to find that outlaws make the most loyal friends you'll ever have. As they sat by the stream in comfortable silence, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been a bitter, isolated woman, hiding from the world's judgment. Tonight, she was part of a chosen family that had embraced her not despite her flaws, but including them. She had fed a dying outlaw her last bread, and in return had been given something far more valuable than food. She had been given a second chance at life itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new dangers. But tonight, Margaret Whitmore was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who understood that sometimes the most meaningful families were the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born into. She had found her way home at last. Not to a place but to a people, not to safety but to purpose, not to respectability but to something far more precious: unconditional acceptance among the beautifully broken outcasts, who had made their own rules for living and loving in a world that had no place for them. 3 months had passed since Margaret Whitmore first opened her cabin door to a dying stranger, and the woman who now stood in the valley's medical clinic bore little resemblance to the bitter hermit who had spent 2 years hiding from the world's judgment. Her hands, once soft from years of gentle domestic work, now bore the calluses of someone who split wood, tended livestock, and performed surgery by lamplight when circumstances demanded it. The valley had prospered under her care. Word had spread through the underground networks that connected various outlaw communities. There was a place in the Colorado mountains where wounded men could find skilled medical attention without questions or legal complications. Margaret had treated gunshot wounds, knife cuts, broken bones from horse falls, and fevers that might have proved fatal without proper intervention. But it was the arrival of Elena Rodriguez that truly tested Margaret's commitment to her new life. Elena had been brought to the valley unconscious, bleeding from multiple wounds inflicted by bounty hunters who had cornered her gang near Durango. She was perhaps 18 years old, with the kind of fierce beauty that suggested she had learned early to defend herself in a world that preyed on young women without protection. The men who carried her and spoke of her with a mixture of respect And Fira, Lena Rodriguez, was known throughout the territory as someone who could outdraw most men and outthink the rest. "She's been shot twice," announced Jake Morrison, the grizzled outlaw who had led the rescue party. "Once in the shoulder, once in the side. Lost a lot of blood getting here." Margaret examined the unconscious girl with clinical detachment, though. Her heart ached at seeing someone so young already marked by violence. The shoulder wound was clean but deep, while the side wound had nicked Elena's liver, a potentially fatal injury if not treated immediately. "I need to operate," Margaret announced. "Catherine, prepare the surgical instruments. Jesse, I'll need you to hold her steady. This is going to be delicate work." For 3 hours, Margaret worked to repair the damage done by bounty hunters' bullets. Elena's youth was in her favor, but she had lost dangerous amounts of blood and would need careful monitoring during her recovery. Margaret sutured torn tissue, cleaned debris from the wounds, and prayed to whatever powers might be listening that her skills would be sufficient to save this fierce young life. Elena woke 2 days later, her dark eyes immediately alert despite her weakened condition. The first thing she did was reach for a gun that wasn't there, her hand instinctively moving to where her holster would normally rest. "Easy," Margaret said softly, placing a gentle hand on Elena's uninjured arm. "You're safe. You're among friends. Where am I?" Elena's voice was hoarse but determined. "Hidden Valley in the Colorado mountains. You were brought here after bounty hunters attacked your group near Durango." Elena's eyes narrowed as she processed this information. "My men, what happened to?" "My men?" Margaret exchanged glances with Catherine, who had been helping with Elena's care. They had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would bring Elena pain that no medical treatment could heal. "3 of them made it out," Catherine said gently. "2 didn't. I'm sorry." The grief that passed across Elena's face was quickly suppressed, replaced by the hard mask that Margaret had learned to recognize in people who survived by never showing weakness. But she had seen enough pain in her months in the valley to recognize it even when it was hidden. "Tell me about the men who didn't make it," Elena said quietly. Margaret listened as Jake Morrison recounted the ambush, how the bounty hunters had used information that could only have come from someone close to Elena's operation, how they had known exactly when and where the gang would be vulnerable. It was the same pattern that had nearly destroyed the Caldwell brothers in Pueblo, the signature of corruption that reached far beyond simple law enforcement. "They're connected," Elena said when the story was finished. "The people who betrayed you and the ones who betrayed me, they're working together." Marcus Caldwell, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the clinic. "What makes you say that?" "Because the bounty hunter who shot me, I recognized him. Name's Fletcher Garrett. Works for a group of businessmen in Denver who've been trying to corner the territorial government contracts. He's not just hunting outlaws for the rewards, he's eliminating people who might interfere with their operations." Margaret felt pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. The conspiracy that had murdered the Caldwell parents, corrupted the Pueblo bank job, and now targeted Elena's gang wasn't just about stealing from territorial funds, it was about controlling the entire political and economic structure of the Colorado territory. "How do you know about Garrett's employers?" Marcus asked. Elena's smile was sharp and predatory. "Because before they decided I was a threat, they tried to hire me, offered good money to eliminate certain obstacles to their business interests. When I refused, they marked me for death." "What kind of obstacles?" "Honest politicians, reform-minded judges, territorial investigators who asked too many questions. Anyone who might interfere with their plans to control mining rights, land grants, and government contracts." Elena tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the movement. "They're not just stealing money, they're stealing the future of the entire territory." Margaret absorbed this information with growing alarm. She had thought that helping Jesse had involved her in a relatively small conspiracy, a local corruption scheme that could be resolved with the right evidence. But Elena's revelation suggested something far more extensive, a coordinated effort to control the political and economic development of the entire Colorado territory. Do you have evidence? Margaret asked. Some, hidden in various places throughout my territory. Names, dates, correspondence between the conspirators. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by anger and determination. But it's scattered incomplete. We'd need to gather all the pieces to make a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of what Elena was suggesting. You're talking about going to war with some of the most powerful men in the territory. Men with money, influence, and armed enforcement at their disposal. I'm talking about finishing what your parents started, Elena replied. About making sure their murders weren't in vain. The conversation continued late into the evening, as Elena shared what she knew about the conspiracy, and the Caldwell brothers contributed their own intelligence. Margaret found herself taking detailed notes, using her medical training to organize information systematically and look for patterns that others might miss. What emerged was a picture of breathtaking corruption, a network of businessmen, politicians, and enforcers who had been systematically looting the territorial government for years. They had murdered anyone who threatened their operations, corrupted law enforcement to protect their interests, and eliminated honest citizens who might have exposed their crimes. The question, said Daniel quietly, is what we do about it. We finish gathering the evidence, Elena said firmly. We put together a case so airtight that even their corrupted allies can't ignore it. And then we make sure it reaches people who can act on it. People like who? Samuel asked skeptically. Everyone with real power is either part of the conspiracy or too intimidated to oppose it. Not everyone, Elena replied. There are federal investigators, territorial officials in Washington who aren't part of the local network. We get the evidence to them, let them clean the house. Margaret listened to the planning discussions with a mixture of excitement and terror. These people were talking about taking on some of the most dangerous men in the territory, risking everything. They had built to seek justice for crimes that most people would never even know had been committed. But as she looked around the clinic at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, Margaret realized that she couldn't imagine doing anything else. These were people who had been cast out by society for refusing to accept injustice, who had built their own community based on loyalty and mutual protection. If they were willing to risk everything to expose the truth, then she would stand with them. What would you need from me? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Elena looked at her with new respect. You're a respected woman, or you were before you came here. Your testimony about what happened to Jesse, about the evidence you've seen, that would carry weight with federal investigators. They'd be more likely to believe someone like you than someone like us. Someone like me, someone who doesn't look like an outlaw. Someone who chose this life to help people rather than to profit from crime. Someone whose word might actually matter to people in power. Margaret understood what Elena was suggesting, that she would need to return to the world she had fled, to face the judgment and condemnation she had spent 2 years avoiding. The thought was terrifying, but also oddly liberating. She was no longer the broken woman who had hidden in shame after Thomas's death. She had found purpose and family among the outcasts, had learned that her value wasn't determined by society's approval. When do we start? She asked. The plan they developed over the following weeks was audacious and dangerous. Elena's men would gather the scattered evidence from her various hiding places, while the Caldwell brothers retrieved the documents they had been seeking in Pueblo. Margaret would travel to Denver to meet with federal investigators, carrying testimony and evidence that would hopefully trigger a full investigation. It was Jesse who pointed out the central irony of their situation. You came here as a refugee, he said to Margaret as they prepared for her departure. Now you're leaving as our ambassador to the outside world. Funny how things change. Margaret packed her few possessions for the second time in 3 months. But this journey felt completely different from her flight to the valley. Then, she had been running from something. Now, she was running toward something, toward justice, toward purpose, toward the possibility of making a difference in the world. "Are you sure about this?" Catherine asked as Margaret prepared to leave. "Once you go back out there, there's no guarantee you'll be safe, even if the investigation succeeds." "I'm sure," Margaret replied. "For 2 years, I thought safety was the most important thing. But I've learned there are things more important than being safe, such as being useful, being part of something that matters, having a family worth fighting for." The ride down from the hidden valley felt like traveling between worlds. Margaret was leaving behind the community of outcasts who had taught her what it meant to belong, returning to a society that had rejected her, but now needed her testimony to achieve justice. As she reached the main road that would take her to Denver, Margaret looked back once at the mountains that concealed the valley, and the people who had become her family. Whatever happened in the coming weeks, whatever dangers she would face or prices she would pay, she knew that she had finally found her place in the world. She had fed a dying outlaw her last bread, and in return had been given something far more valuable than food. She had been given a second chance at life, at purpose, at love. The bitter, isolated woman who had opened her cabin door to a stranger was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most meaningful lives were often lived in service to others, regardless of what society thought about the people being served. Margaret Whitmore rode toward Denver, carrying evidence that would topple a corrupt empire. But more importantly, she carried the knowledge that she was no longer alone. Behind her in the hidden valley, a chosen family of outcasts waited for her return, proof that love and loyalty could flourish even among those whom the world had declared irredeemable. The price of a single loaf of bread, offered freely to a stranger in need, had purchased something beyond measure, a transformation from bitter exile to purposeful belonging, from meaningless safety to dangerous significance. Margaret had learned that sometimes the most important choice you could make was to open your door when someone knocked, regardless of how dangerous they might appear or what complications their presence might bring to your carefully ordered life. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret Whitmore smiled for the first time in years and rode on toward whatever future awaited her, secure in the knowledge that she was finally, completely, exactly who she was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.